Good. I have enough to lose.
See?
That's not good. You can pull off. That's like that's like a Shuri.
What's in one for last?
Like that three is like a Shuri can get a three. Yeah, three and if you
Everything you do is just
you get a one.
All right. Oh, wow, let's see. What time is it? There's bowling. Good thing we waited. Good thing we waited. There's bowling. Oh, let's see. Let's do this first. Let's, Worms, where you at?
I'm ready.
Later. You know how to do this. You know how to work the machine.
Yeah, I can do that.
Can you put a DVD up?
Worms, if anybody can do it. If there's a human being alive that can do it. All right. So, let's turn to this page. You know what would be good? If I had glasses and I'd be able to see.
That could be helpful.
That's what glasses are for.
Better contacts.
You think somebody else is coming?
It's only 6:31.
Oh, there's Belay.
Fashionably late, as always.
He's 1 minute late. Give him a break.
Oh my God, you're right.
Belay, you're a very important part of this operation.
Late and break.
Yeah. Well, the way you said it.
Whoa!
Oh.
Oh! Now we're getting fine attendance. So, who said they were here last time? And you were taking some level of notes. So I think, now that I think back on it, when I was looking over the, and thinking about what we talked about, I think we got all the way into electing George Washington as president, sort of setting the stage for launching the new government under a new constitution, had elected Washington as president, had Congress pass the first Judicial Act, the Judicial Act of 1789. I'm certain we made mention that that Judicial Act was going to be declared unconstitutional by Marbury versus Madison. I can remember Ben saying that. Darn it if I can remember Ben saying that. And I also think that we talked about the first cabinet and how Washington established, there's friends of mine attending, that how Washington established a precedent. And the precedent wasn't that there were secretaries of executive departments. Congress created the secretaries of executive departments. There's a secretary of the Treasury, a secretary of state, a secretary of war. Congress divided the federal government into departments, and Congress still divides the federal government into departments. What Washington did is establish the practice of conferring with those secretaries as a council of advisors. And that establishes the notion of a cabinet. Okay, and I know we talked about that. And then I think we said, look, in that cabinet, Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury, the person in charge of the government's money, was the most important person. And he was charged by Congress to come up with some plans, which he did. He came up with a plan on public credit. He came up with a plan for a national bank. He came up with a plan for taxes and tariffs. He came up with reports, they were called. A report on public credit, a report on a national bank, a report on taxes and tariffs, and a report on manufacturing. And so we talked about Hamilton's financial plan, I think. And we talked about the debate over the bank. Does this sound familiar? Between Hamilton and Jefferson. We talked about the proposals of funding at par and assumption. And we may have mentioned, I think this is where we left off, taxes and tariffs. That Hamilton proposed a variety of taxes. I mean, even before Hamilton took office, there was an excise, a tariff. But he proposed some other excise taxes to finance the government's activities, which are going to become a problem later. Now, with Hamilton's plan unfolding, now I'm even thinking more, we may have mentioned it generated opposition. There was opposition to Hamilton's plan. And that opposition eventually crystallized around James Madison and his supporters, who called themselves Republicans. who saw Hamilton and his proposals as being the worst nightmare of what they feared out of the national government under the Constitution. The Republicans kind of came out of the anti-federalist sentiment, although Madison, the original leader of the Republicans, was a Federalist. And so Madison is increasingly concerned with the action of Hamilton and the national government, and organizes a faction. And this faction, the Republicans, actively opposes Hamilton's proposals. They are against assumption. They are against funding at par. They are against a national bank. They are resentful of some of the taxes. And so what we see kind of coalescing there is the beginnings of embryonic political parties. Now, you must know that neither side, the Federalists that supported Hamilton and his proposals and advocated for a strong national government, and the Republicans who are increasingly wary of a strong national government, particularly one that was largely dominated by Hamilton, that neither faction thought it was a good idea to be a part of a faction. Right? Neither faction thought that organized political parties would be productive, or even if they were loyal. Hamilton didn't think, it is proper for a faction to arise against a republicly or a democratically elected Republican government. I mean, if the government is of the people and you're against the government, then you, by virtue of being against the government, is against the people. And so sort of organized opposition against the government was something that was sort of unfolding. What really intensifies the opposition against the government is the French Revolution. The French Revolution kind of exposes the differences in ideology between the factions. I mean, at the core of Hamilton, at the core of the Republicans and Federalists, was the ideological differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton was fundamentally a conservative. He was suspicious of human nature. He supported a powerful national government that would provide for order and stability. To Hamilton, order, stability, private property was more important than maybe liberty. Order was more important than liberty. Liberty could only be obtained with order to the Hamiltonians. And the people could not be trusted. So because the people could not be trusted, particularly in mass, a powerful national government was necessary to keep things in check and to protect the rights of the minority, property rights, and other things. I mean, I don't know that Hamilton may appear to be like a monarchist. That's what his critics accused him of being. But I'm not sure that was true. He just believed that the Republican experiment was only going to be preserved with kind of an aristocratic, powerful national government where the powerful and the bright kind of parentalistically took care of the common folk. The Republicans that were eventually led by Jefferson believed that the people were inherently good, that the national government was a threat to liberty. I mean, on some level, the Hamiltonians thought the threat to liberty was disorder, right? The Jeffersonians thought the threat to liberty was an autocratic, powerful, oppressive national government that would take away the rights of the people. And so they necessarily wanted a weak national government rather than a strong one. And they wanted governments, closer to the people. And they had confidence in the people's ability to govern themselves. And so these ideological differences are really laid bare when it comes to the French Revolution. At first, everybody supported the French Revolution, Federalists and Republicans alike. But when the Revolution turned chaotic, when the reign of terror and heads rolled in the streets of Paris. I was just thinking I was talking about, Whelan, I think, is up in his room. He had an appointment. He's going to come down later. But he probably just, when I said the French Revolution, he probably perked up. He probably went like this. Someone in the world is talking the French Revolution. I must come down, right? I must come down and speak of it myself. I bet he did perk up. I bet he hears. I bet he wanders down anywhere. Now, if I said German unification, he would fly down. Right? So anyways, the French Revolution, when it reaches its bloody phase, the Federalists say, see, this is what we're talking about. This is what happens when there is disorder. This is what happens when the things that stabilize society are subject to sort of the whims and the wills of the masses. So to the Federalists, the French Revolution was evidence that they were right. To the Republicans, the French Revolution was a necessary, maybe some parts of an unfortunate step towards, ultimately freeing the world from oppression. And so the differences over the French Revolution are going to intensify the political factions, especially when that becomes an issue for the country. Now, I don't know if you remember how the French Revolution becomes an issue for America. Did someone raise their hand? Did you interested in that? Well, I'll tell you quickly. I'll ask you some other question in a moment. But ultimately, the French Revolution becomes an issue for America because France and England go to war. The combined monarchs of Europe, led by England, attempt to reestablish the monarchy in France. When they do, the French Republic, attacks, and there is this struggle that is basically France versus England. And the treaty that was signed in the aftermath of the Battle of Saratoga, the treaty that brought France into the Revolutionary War, was still in force. And it obliged the United States to support the French if France went to war with England and that war spilled into the Caribbean, which it had done. And so on some level, America had to decide, now this fledgling new country, whether we were going to honor our treaty obligations with France or whether we were going to kind of ignore them and proclaim neutrality. Washington, the then President of the United States, unilaterally, without congressional approval or discussion, proclaims the United States neutral. And this generates a lot of consternation. Republicans and many in America think that, look, we have a moral obligation, a treaty obligation, a diplomatic obligation to support the French. But Washington reasoned that such support would undermine the country, and so he moves for neutrality. Now the French, by the time neutrality had been proclaimed, had sent an envoy, Citizen Genet, to America. And if you remember, Genet's trip to America on one level showed that there was significant support for France, but on another level, Genet alienated, particularly Washington, because of his very unneutral actions. But the rejection of Genet, the proclamation of neutrality, and eventually Washington's actions with the Whiskey Rebellion are going to further inflame Republican opposition against the government. So let me lay it out. Okay, the Washington government that is urged by Hamilton said, look, we're in no position to fight to support France, our ally, the ones that helped us in the revolution against Britain. We can't help them. We're neutral. That's it. Now, Genet is rejected. We say we're not strong enough to assist the French. But when the rebellious farmers in western Pennsylvania refuse to pay an excise tax that they think unfairly taxes them, Washington sends 12 to 15,000 troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. On the frontier itself, the national government had not been very successful in quelling Indian disputes. So the result was, increasingly, the Republicans said, well, wait a minute. I thought you weren't strong enough to use the army, but you used it against us. And so the result was even a greater anxiety about the national government and a greater division between Republicans and Federalists. Remember, the Federalists see the Whiskey Rebellion as an attempt to overthrow the national government. I mean, like we said before, it's kind of quaint. the Whiskey Rebellion, because we think of like these hillbilly farmers from western PA, rebelling to keep their booze, their moonshine. But I think that source I gave you suggested, if any of you remember, well, that would assume that somebody read it. But if any of you remember reading it, I think they argued in that source that the Whiskey Rebellion was the greatest threat to the national government between the Constitution and the Civil War. So the Whiskey Rebellion, Federalists saw as a significant threat. And they wanted to prove that kind of insurrection and defiance of the national government wouldn't be tolerated. The end result is more tension between the factions. Further, that tension is exacerbated by the British action in response to our neutrality. We proclaim ourselves neutral and decide we are going to trade with both sides. So we trade with the British and the French. We sell things to the French and the sugar houses. The British resent this trade, and they use their powerful navy to stop us from trading with France in the Caribbean. Not only do they stop us, but they impress sailors, right? Remember we talked about that, impressment? Now, it's kind of interesting. Here we go. England and France is at war. The United States attempts to remain neutral, right? Attempts to remain neutral. But England wants to define that neutrality in a way different than we want to. We deeply resent Britain's actions in stopping our vessels, impressing our sailors. It seems like they're not respecting our sovereignty. American people are ready to go to war against Britain. In one last-ditch effort, Washington sends an envoy to England to try to negotiate a treaty. Does anybody remember who he sent go ahead, Turkey. John Jay, right? We remember that. He sent John Jay. And the Republicans didn't like it because Jay was considered to be an Anglophile, somebody that liked the British. And Jay goes over there and he's handicapped by Hamilton right off the bat. He negotiates a terrible treaty that was called the Treaty of London, or Jay's Treaty, that really just didn't do much but avoid war with Britain. The treaty was eventually accepted, even though it was a terrible treaty, further inflaming sort of the partisan differences between the Republicans and Federalists, even to the point where Washington himself was being criticized. And it's with that, the debate over Jay's treaty, the criticism that Washington received over it, that Washington decides to retire from the presidency in 1896. Now, when Washington decides to retire, we said the significant thing about his retirement was that he decides to send a message to the country. His valedictorian, his farewell address. And you get the picture of Washington looking out there and saying, okay, what are the big problems the country faces? And the one thing that Washington sort of talks about in his farewell address in September of 1796 is bickering partisan politics. The attacks that he received. Washington never saw himself as being part of a party. Even though he is widely considered a Federalist, he never saw himself as a party. And really, it was only late in the game when the Republicans began to actually criticize him. And then they frequently said, well, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He's under the spell of Hamilton. So Hamilton was kind of the real saint. No one really wanted to criticize Washington. He was too... Even then, even his critics, recognized his sort of stature. Well, anyways, so Washington sees this as a problem. And the other thing he says, beware of entangling alliances with European powers, right? And so this is called Washington's farewell address, and we trace this all through American history. We said, look, it was Wilson in 1917, in April of 1917, who asked the American people to kind of set aside Washington's fateful warning and entangle themselves in World War I, and with the hopes of making the world safe for democracy. Remember, we said when that didn't work out, Americans were frustrated by that, and they kind of retracted back into isolationism. We violated our kind of ancient tradition, we violated our ancient tradition, and now we got burned. We talked about that, before. And that's why Americans were so reluctant to embrace World War II, despite the fact it was kind of clear that our safety and security was being threatened. So, okay, we talked about, Washington's farewell address, but now we have in November of '96 the first contested election in American history. Now, remember, these elections are still going to be determined by the Electoral College. And the members of the votes in the Electoral College are still determined by the state legislatures of the individual states. So you don't have a full-out popular election yet. Probably about 20% of eligible voters are actually casting ballots for a presidential candidate in 1796. But you have two parties here. You've got the Federalist Party that is supporting John Adams, the vice president under, Washington. You've got the Republican Party that is supporting Thomas Jefferson, their ideological leader. There's not really a campaign by these people. Adams and Jefferson do not campaign for themselves. Remember, we said the first person to... Does anybody remember who the first person to actually actively campaign for himself was? I mean, I only mentioned this in passing, yes.
Jackson.
No. I really only mentioned this. It would be a feat of memorization to remember this. And the person did not win. No, you would always think so. When you think of losers, it was actually Stephen A. Douglas. He was the first one. And if you think about it, the reason that Douglas did it is because the situation was so dire. The situation was so dire that Douglas actually violated the tradition of not campaigning for yourself to campaign for himself. And then even in the Gilded Age, they kind of backed away. It was, again, Bryan who probably started the practice of more actively campaigning. You had the front porch campaigns. And then I think with the election of 12 and Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, you get more of the popular campaign. But nevertheless, Adams is narrowly elected to succeed Washington. He takes over. Now, does anybody remember what the big issue was in the Adams administration? Does anyone besides the instructor? Worms, go ahead, buddy.
Potential war with France?
Yes. France didn't like Jay's treaty. So since France didn't like Jay's treaty, they thought it was a concession to Britain. What they did then was do the same thing that Britain did. Violate our neutrality, impress our sailors, stop our shipping, kicked our ambassador out of France. They actually thought electing John Adams was an insult to France, right? Because the pro-French, the Francophile, Jefferson was rejected. Because Jefferson was an admirer of the French. Remember, he had been the ambassador to France. Well, okay, Adams sends 3 envoys to try to negotiate a treaty. They are rejected. The French foreign minister Talleyrand demands a bribe. They say not a cent. The XYZ affair is what's used to describe that. And this kind of leads to a quasi-war, a naval war between France and the United States, that at any time could break into a full-scale war. Now, we said that Adams, to his credit, is not going to allow the war to expand to a full-scale war. He thwarts Hamilton's efforts to build an army. He really prides himself in not allowing this war to expand. And when he has an opportunity to end the war, despite the fact that it made him personally popular. Remember that creepy guy was singing that song on that thing? Remember I showed you that tape and that guy was singing that song? And they were saying to Adams, you have all Washington, all of Philadelphia is at your feet, and you're very popular. And despite the fact that Adams' popularity was tremendously enhanced by the prospect of going to war with France, he avoided it. But maybe not so much to his credit, he supports legislation, the Alien and Sedition Acts, that are intended to silence opposition to his government. The Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act was to kind of clamp down on illegal aliens that the government thought might be pro-French, right? To deport them, to extend the time that was necessary for citizenship. The Sedition Act silenced, right, opposition, made it illegal to be critical of the government during this time. Now remember, we've got the Sedition Act of 1798, and then we had the Sedition Act of 1917. That during World War I, it was also illegal to be critical of the national government in the war. And just like the Sedition Act of 1789, people were imprisoned and fined if they were critical. And in the case of 1789, the people that were imprisoned and fined were Republicans. The Federalist judges put these people in jail. Newspaper editors were in prison. Newspaper editors were fined. And people said, well, wait a minute. This can't possibly be consistent with the First Amendment to the Constitution. Doesn't the First Amendment of the Constitution say that you have a right to free speech, even if it's, inflammatory? Now, we talked about this a little bit. We said this was significant. The Republicans cannot challenge the Sedition Act in the Supreme Court, even though the Sedition Act seemed blatantly in contradiction to the First Amendment. Why not? Why couldn't those Republicans challenge the Sedition Act in the Supreme Court? Dear Kristen.
Were not the judges like federal?
Yes. Remember, all the justices that had been appointed to the Supreme Court had been appointed by Federalists. And the Federalists supported this legislation. So the leaders of the Republicans who opposed the Sedition Act challenge it in a different way. They challenge it with the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. Now, the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions are simply that, resolutions. They have no standing in law. They are the resolutions of two legislatures, Virginia and Kentucky. I think that the Virginia was written by Madison, the Kentucky was written by Jefferson. And in these resolutions, they outline something. What do they say? Why are they significant? Even though they had no force of law, nothing like that, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are significant. Why? Yes, go ahead.
They brought up the idea of states individually.
Yes. States individually to some extent. They brought up the idea of states doing what? Go ahead, say it. Say it. Who will say it? Murray, will you say it? Will you say it?
Nullify?
Yes. They brought up the idea of states nullifying or interpreting the Constitution. The question is, who can declare an action of Congress to be unconstitutional? Who is the final arbiter of constitutionality? Who is the one that determines what's part of the deal? The Constitution, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions argued, was a compact among sovereign states. Now, considering the anniversary today, April 12th, 1861, remember that the Confederate states are going to argue basically what Jefferson and Madison argued in 1798, that this Constitution, the Union, was an agreement amongst sovereign states, that they had entered into the Union. I'll be with you in just one moment. They had entered into the Union and they could leave the Union, right? Now, Jefferson not Jefferson and Madison, but Hamilton and others rejected that. They said, oh, no, this is an agreement amongst the people. I mean, Lincoln, obviously is going to reject this. You can't leave. The Union is indivisible. Now, this issue is not resolved at this point. It's not resolved at this point, but it is raised at this point. No other states support the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. They don't have the force of law. The notion drops after the election of 1800. Because in the election of 1800, we know that Thomas Jefferson is finally elected to the presidency. Wow, it's a rainy day, is it not? It's a terrible rainy day. But he's finally elected to the presidency. Some call Jefferson's election the revolution of 1800. Why? Why would they call it a revolution, right? Or did they call it another revolution? Yes, go ahead.
The spirit of 1776 versus the spirit of 1783.
Wow, that's pretty good. But it's not 83, it's 87. But that's good though, Worms. You know, I mean, the supporters of Jefferson suggested that, look, this is the renewal of the spirit of 1776. The ideals of the Declaration of Independence are going to be put into government. The Federalists had distorted the whole thing. They had monarchized it, right? They had made it like a monarchy, right? You know, they had done that, and they had stolen it away. And now Jefferson, the true defender, the author of the Declaration of Independence, was going to bring it back. You know, and he now, as president with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, would show the world and the country what the kind of government that was envisioned by the founders would look like. Now, interestingly enough, it kind of doesn't turn out that way. Right? I mean, the Jeffersonian vision of an agrarian utopia. Remember, Jefferson said, we don't need cities and we don't need industry, and what we need is a nation of farmers, an agrarian utopia with small government, and, you know, sort of the enlightened farmer leading the way during this time. It doesn't work out that way. You know, the end of it, if you think about, this is 1800. 100 years later, in 1900, what do you have? America as an urban industrial place. Right? This is not what Jefferson wanted. Right? This is not what Jefferson wanted, and Jefferson did not even think Republican government could survive that. The Republican government cannot survive in the city and in the factory. And by 1900, that's what America was. And remember, we talked about that, you know, now. How does the ideological notions that Jefferson and Hamilton sort of laid out in 1800, how do they translate into 1900? How do they translate, liberal and conservative translate into a different world? And that's what we wrote essays. They were pretty good essays that the kids wrote. I was putting them in the computer today. There were a number of A's. Yes, yeah, there were a number of A's. That was good. Maybe the kids learned something over the year. I don't know, Malay. I mean, you may have learned something. It's possible. You know, so yeah, they were good essays. I mean, and that's kind of what we were talking about, right? Well, okay. Well, Jefferson gets in there, and he does try. Jefferson tries to implement that. But even before Jefferson gets in, the Federalists take one last swipe at the new Republican government. That final swipe at the Republican government is go ahead, Worms.
The Midnight Judges?
Yes, the Judicial Act of 1801. The Judicial Act of 1801 expands the federal judiciary, and then the then President John Adams attempts to stack that federal judiciary with lifetime appointees, Federalists. Now, who is the most important midnight judge? The most important midnight judge. Go ahead.
Jay, right?
Who?
Jay.
Jay? No, I don't know. I don't know if I'd say Jay. Go ahead, Ben.
Marshall.
John Marshall. You probably wanted to say Marshall, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yes, I thought. You had Jay on the mind. You had damn John Jay. Damn everyone who won't sit up. You know, you had Jay on the mind. You wanted to say John Marshall, who was Supreme Court Chief Justice from 1801 to 1834, and arguably the most important. A dyed-in-the-wool Federalist who took, you know, the position of Chief Justice and held it until 1834. He was, a number of, you know, midnight judges were appointed. And the New Republicans are going to try to set that straight with the Judicial Act of 1802. They also try other things to set that straight, besides the Judicial Act of 1802. They also try to impeach, I don't really talk about this in class, but they try to impeach some you know, Federalist midnight judges and others. They try to weaken the judiciary that way. And they also try to weaken the judiciary that they consider to be the least democratic branch of government. Oh, you know, I was just thinking, in the third period, who do I have in the third period? They're way behind. We were just talking about like Jefferson now in the third period, right? You know, the fourth and sixth they are in World War II, and they're talking about Jefferson in the third. But today in the third period, we talked about the court packing bill, you know. And so it seems to me that there's kind of a similarity there, right? You know, the court packing bill in the New Deal, when Roosevelt tries to kind of take control of the court, right, to take control of the court, is on some level rejected, right? And when the Republicans try to dominate the court, they are equally rejected. You know, I don't know if the court emerges from the court packing bill more powerful, but the court does emerge from the Republican onslaught on it a little bit more powerful. largely because of the case of Marbury versus Madison. Now, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, what is at issue? Right? What is at issue there? What is the case all about? Do you remember, Elizabeth Yezza? When you're a lawyer someday and you're sitting in law school and they ask you this question, some old man professor asks you this question, you'll know, but you won't send me a card or anything. Go ahead.
Didn't Madison mail out the letters to get?
He didn't deliver Marbury's, what would we call it? His commission. Right? He didn't deliver Marbury's commission. So Marbury went to court, Elizabeth, to get what? The Supreme Court to order Madison to deliver the commission. He wanted a writ of mandamus. And so if the court agreed and ordered the writ, what was Madison going to do? Do you remember? He was going to ignore it, weakening the Supreme Court. If he refused to order the writ, that would have been an admission that the court didn't have the authority in the first place. Now, what Marshall does in the case of Marbury versus Madison is he declares the part of the Judicial Act of 1789 that gave the court the authority to issue writs of mandamus unconstitutional. So he denied the court authority. Hey, we'd like to issue this writ, but we can't because Congress overstepped its bounds in giving us the authority to issue these writs. So what he did is declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. Now, that act of Congress made the court stronger, but he denied the court power to get more power. And the more power was the final say on constitutionality. Who has the final say on what is constitutional? Look, go back to the court packing bill of 1937. Franklin Roosevelt was stuck. If the Supreme Court said that his legislation was unconstitutional, he had no recourse. Right? There was no recourse. His recourse was try to pack the court with people that was supportive of him, which backfired on him. Right? So it shows you how strong Marbury versus Madison was. Well, all right. So Marbury versus Madison is certainly a setback for Jeffersonian ideology. I don't know if you would argue the Louisiana Purchase was a setback either. You know, I mean, it's certainly not a setback for the country. You know, the Louisiana Purchase is this fortunate acquisition of all of the territory west of the Mississippi River to really some unknown border with Spanish Mexico. A doubling of the size of the country that occurs basically because of happenstance. You know, Napoleon had secretly acquired the territory and then no longer need. Oh, why did Napoleon eventually decide to dump that territory? You know, yeah, go on.
The rebellion in Haiti?
Yes, the rebellion in Haiti. You know, the sugar island there was unsuccessful. Toussaint Louverture, the leader there, was successful in preventing French from reestablishing power there. This thwarted their plan, and this is when Napoleon said, "We don't need this anymore. We will sell it to you, the United States, for a mere $15 million." Was it $15 million? I think $15 million. And Napoleon, dumps it on the United States, and the negotiators accept it. But when they bring the treaty back, Jefferson is torn. Remember, Jefferson is this strict constructionist. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. Right? He is this strict constructionist. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. And now, where did it say in the Constitution that you could do this? Well, Jefferson wanted to pass a constitutional amendment. But he ignores kind of his own ideology and submits a treaty that would annex this territory into the United States, showing sort of the practical reality of the circumstance. And it really is a kind of a vindication of Hamilton's broad interpretation of the Constitution. But on some level, that's why I said, Jefferson is forced to backpedal on his ideology in that area. But in terms of that, he does double the size of the United States. Those territories are going to be agrarian. They're going to typically vote, Republican. Jefferson does reduce the size of the Army, does reduce the size of the Navy, diplomatic corps, attempts to scale back on the things that he thinks kind of are vestiges of the monarchy and the presidency, state dinners, other things like that. I mean, he's the first legitimate reduction in the size of government in American history, maybe the only legitimate reduction. Well, probably in the aftermath of war, there were legitimate reductions in the size of government, but probably the only peacetime legitimate reduction in the size of government. I was listening today on the news, and some of the critics of the recent budget proposal were saying, well, we spent more last year than we spent this year. Well, yeah, there you go. Right? I mean, the size of government has increased and increased and increased and increased. And probably Jefferson was one of the few to actually scale it back. And it was small to begin with. And so, you know, that was part of his ideology. When Jefferson in 1804 was easily reelected, I mean, he was very popular. You know, it seemed like he had done the things that his constituency wanted him to do. But he does run into problems in 1807. And remember, those problems are, again, a function of problems in Europe. Now, I mean, if you think about it, the United States, and we talked about this today, not Kristen in the third period, because we're back there at the Civil War in the third period, but in the fourth and the sixth period, we talked about this today, that Americans kind of naively believed that somehow Europe could be caught up in this titanic struggle and we could stay out of it. Well, we couldn't even stay out of war in Europe when, in kind of a less modern world. You know, when the Napoleonic Wars, you know, broke out in Europe, and eventually England and France went to war, you know, this affects us. You know, the British, again, attempt to prevent trade between us and France. And they impress our sailors, and they you know, stop our shipping, and this act of impressment, you know, is something that Americans don't like. Jefferson's approach to Britain's actions on the high sea, what was it? It was in one act, one thing that he pushed Congress to do. Does anyone besides the instructor remember? Anyone besides, Jowsey, do you think anybody but the instructor remembers? Surely, Murray, you remember. Darn you. Marissa, surely you remember.
Is it the embargo?
You did remember. I'm so happy. It is the Embargo Act. Yes, the Embargo Act, which was passed. What was the idea of the Embargo Act? Does anyone besides Andrew and myself recall? Andrew, what was the idea? To get Britain to respect our neutrality and to get France to respect our neutrality, what were we going to do? Yes, with both powers. With the world. We were going to cut off world trade. Now, the Embargo Act, interestingly enough, was the most intrusive piece of federal legislation that had ever been passed. So this is Jefferson, the strict interpreter of the Constitution, the person that liked small government, the person that wanted everybody left alone, who pushed Congress to pass the most intrusive piece of legislation that had ever been proposed and passed and, you know, enforced in American history. Now it's up to 1807 now. And certainly there was a backlash against the Embargo Act. You know, New Englanders thought this was terrible. You know, it seriously hurt their commerce. Ports shut down. People were unemployed. You know, many people thought it was cowardly. You know, but on some level, what Jefferson was hearkening back to with the Embargo Act was the Revolution. Remember the embargoes during the Revolution in an attempt to get England to respect, you know, or to withdraw their taxation had been successful. So we're going to go back to this. And it was enlightened. Humans can work things out without going to war. But it's ultimately unsuccessful because it's, you know, routinely ignored, evaded. You know, there are problems associated with it. It's ultimately unsuccessful. So the Embargo Act, you know, and it weakens, you know, Jefferson's popularity. He also is going to leave office in 1808. He is going to be frustrated and leave office in 1808 because of the embargo. Hang on there 1 second, I'll be right with you. Yes, yeah, let's give it another 5 minutes. Then, so where are we to the embargo? And so Jefferson is out, right? And Madison, his protege, is going to be elected president in 1808. And so in the Madison administration, what's the big deal? What's the big deal? Yes?
War of 1812.
The War of 1812, right? Now, you kind of have the United States up to the War of 1812 and the United States after the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is a significant thing. Who is the War of 1812 with? Go ahead, Ben.
British.
Britain. Over what? Over what, Dylan? Darn. So, look, go ahead, Andrew. Sort of. How so, Kristen?
We're just trampling on our neutrality.
It's about neutrality. You know, I mean, the Embargo Act doesn't work. Madison gets in there and he tries other ways to get Britain and France to respect our neutrality, and impressment doesn't stop. You know, and so eventually, a group of congressmen are elected to Congress in 1811 that have had enough. And they are collectively known as the Warhawks, right? And the Warhawks want to set things straight with Britain. But it wasn't just neutrality on the high seas. There was another issue, Worms.
Canada?
Yes, Canada. And the issue with Canada was not that it was Canada, but it was what? What was the issue with Canada? Do you remember anyone besides the instructor? Yes. Pardon me? It was British, and we accused the British of doing what from Canada? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. The western frontier, which was really Ohio and Indiana, was aflame with Native American attacks, and we blamed that on the British. Now, what was the most, I know this is going to be on the AP test. They always have a Native American question, right? They always have a Native American question. And that big Native American leader that tried to unify all the western tribes to push Westerners back was whom? Do you remember? Go ahead, Mandela.
I don't remember.
Darn you, Mandela. Darn you. Regina, do you recall? Darn. Drat. Lucy, do you remember his name? Just another moment, Mrs. Weiss. Is there anybody out there waiting?
Just a couple people. You're good. You're good. Keep going.
Yes. Yeah.
Educate the students.
Yeah,
They're eager for knowledge, I know.
yeah. Go ahead, Lucy. Son of a gun, Nora, did you get a nap after school?
Yeah.
Remember you fell fast asleep. I had to take your pulse in the 7th period because I thought you had passed away. We had to give her we called Nurse Yelch up. Nurse Yelch came and took her vital signs, and she was alive.
Barely.
Still had a pulse. Sometimes, you know, the bond market is not enough to keep people attentive. Okay? So anyway, it was Tecumseh. Tecumseh. And Tecumseh's Native American race. Who eventually, you know, battled with Tecumseh's brother, gets notoriety from this, the Battle of Tippecanoe. Who is the governor of Indiana that, yes?
William Henry Harrison?
William Henry Harrison. So it is William Henry Harrison that gained fame in battling Tecumseh. Just let me say this last thing, and then we'll conclude and we'll take a little break. The big push for war, however, came from the Warhawks. The Warhawks who were elected to Congress really felt that, look, everything had been exhausted. Britain was not respecting our sovereignty. You know, we had to do something to establish this, and the best thing we could do is take Canada, which would be easy. Who is the most famous Warhawk? Henry Clay, that's right. Also, John C. Calhoun is going to join Congress in 1811 as well with Clay. And in addition, I think in 13, Daniel Webster is going to join Congress. And so you're going to get that great triumph of leaders, congressional leaders, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, who are going to dominate politics. But initially, Clay and Calhoun are pushing for war, pushing Madison, the Republican, for war, you know, with England, in order to sort of establish our sovereignty. So let's just do this. Let's start.